Good morning and welcome. You will notice that in front of us we have this very interesting, proudly made in South Africa, Shiraz Grenache in front of us. Can I just say? So if anybody is feeling a desperate need for a kick of energy, like please come, feel free to approach.
Or just give them to me because I've only got hand luggage and I can take a few more.
Okay. Well, welcome to this discussion on Unpacking the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence. I'm very happy to be in conversation with Jeanne, and who I've known for many years and working in the feminist activist space, and Nechama, Brodie. I do see that, unfortunately, we do have a lot of the feminist activists in the space. It feels a bit like preaching to the converted. It would have been nice to have had a lot of people who one doesn't kind of know from the space of trying to change social norms and policies and so on, so that they respond to violence against women. I just want to start with a short bit on terminology. So the National Strategic Plan uses the terminology of gender-based violence and femicide, but in framing this discussion, I'm very deliberately not using gender-based violence, but framing the discussion around violence against women and girls. And hi, Sue, welcome. And I'm doing that because not to say that gender-based violence and that violence against boys and men is unimportant, but that I think particularly in the context of a state that uses gender, the terminology and the discourse of gender to dilute a focus on women's rights, there are spaces and times where we do need to claim the centering of women and girls in relation to violence. And so we're very deliberately doing that here. Nechama has written a book called Domestic Terror. And it's a very interesting book because it very cleverly works together the kinds of things that policymakers and decision makers want to know. So things like the statistics, the policy frameworks. But I think that equally importantly is what she does is she centers the people who have been the victims of violence, specifically those who have lost their lives. And so they are centered, they are anchored in the telling of the story of why this is a huge problem on all of our hands. So I'm going to start maybe by just saying that Nechama is, and I have to read this out because I don't have it memorized, a multimedia journalist, an author and academic, worked as a feature writer, editor, publisher, radio talk show, and TV presenter. That's quite impressive. She's a lecturer at Wits Center for Journalism and heads the Wits Justice Project, a public interest journalism program. Jeanne Bodenstein works at Rape Crisis. She's an advocacy specialist. She heads up the Rape Survivors Justice Campaign and works on lobbying specifically in relation to this criminal justice system and the reforms required there. Jeanne, for all her sins, is the co-convener of the Pillar 3, which deals with the criminal justice system of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence. And we're going to dig into that process, the plan and its process, and the ways in which it's working and not. But maybe if we can just start with you, Nechama, and just tell us a bit about the book, what made you write it, what you were trying to do with it. I love the fact that you use the words retelling, that you were trying to retell stories.
I almost want to sort of take a step back and look at definitions, because if we've got a technical audience, then we might as well put all of those things on the table. Because starting to write this book, which is the third in a series of books that really tries to document fatal violence in South Africa and different types of fatal violence and explore them narratively, but also through the numbers, and try and make them connect in a way that's meaningful and that's useful, and make them somehow intelligible. But part of that, the challenge is also what are the words that we use and what are the definitions we use. And I really like the fact that you said from the outset that we're actually not going to use GBV as our frame. And I think that when we talk about the National Strategic Plan, and in fact all things related to violence against women in particular, but I mean the same could be applied to, say, farm killings, is often one of the biggest challenges we face when we try and make violence intelligible outside of individual experience is the definitions we use. And I feel increasingly like the definitions that are used by the state are reasonable for the state, but they're reasonable in terms of obscuring and delaying delivery of the kinds of service that we want. So it's very, very easy to have sort of an amorphous thing called gender-based violence that's extremely poorly defined. Men also suffer gender-based violence because of their masculinity, and but that's not included in the classic understanding of GBV. There's not even a common conception of femicide amongst the different departments of the state. Domestic violence, which is really the thread that this book follows, and it talks about intimate partner killings, so that could imply, women killing male partners as well, and there are some cases there. But sort of 75 to 80% of intimate partner killings are men killing women, except when you read the police reports, in which case it is boyfriends and girlfriends killing each other as if it's some sort of equal war, where girlfriends have taken up arms against their boyfriends and are taking them out in equal numbers, and that is absolutely not the case. So I think as a sort of foundational point, it's exciting to reject these definitions. They may have utility in reporting, but they're actually dysfunctional, and I think they disable us and they disempower us when it comes to understanding what is being experienced. It would be so nice to have better and more coherent terms across all of the systems of sort of state and civil society. So this book, the first book that I wrote in the murder series, and I wasn't really sure it was going to start, but Naima Masood from Kwela contacted me when I was finishing my PhD and said they wanted to publish a book on femicide, and I was like, why? Not really sure why anybody would want to read about those sorts of things, but they've sustained that, and I'm very grateful for it because I think it's proved to be useful in unexpected areas. So femicide was the first book. Last year, a book came out. I wrote a book about farm killings in South Africa, and this year is domestic terror, which takes a narrative approach rather than a data-based approach, which is usually what I do is I build up a big data set and I explore that. But this time, as Joyce pointed out, I actually started with the stories because it felt quite important. But naming the book was very hard because you couldn't call the book domestic violence, because domestic violence in the police kind of categorization and the courts means any violence that happens in the home. So it could be intergenerational violence, a grandparent, an uncle, and something, and it doesn't tell the story. And the more I read current literature talking about different issues, the thing that really stood out for me was this idea of domestic terror. Because what many of these women who died, and those who survived at great cost, what they experienced was a campaign of terror, sometimes for decades, before one of the people died and ended that. And I mentioned this earlier on in the week to a group in Joburg. If we think about terrorism, terrorism can mean many things, and it means different things in different countries. So it's also not an absolute term. Democracy is not an absolute term. But the intention of terrorism is to cause fear. It's to cause terror. It could be something fatal, or it could just be the threat. And really that's what this book is about, it's this overwhelming sense of this underlying fear and threat that is part of all of these cases that are mentioned in the book, and really the system that it discusses.
Thank you for that. That's a very useful framing and sketching of the terrain of the discussion. So, Jeanne, before we delve into the NSB, for those of us who don't know, I just want to take a step back for a moment in time to where we marched the streets, and you will recall that day. We had the death of Jeanne in the post office, and in that week, there were quite a few deaths of particularly young women. And so there was something about that moment in time, and look, violence against women is happening all the time, but there was something at that point in time that happened and galvanized and kind of harnessed energy, and we took to the streets, and we saw the emergence of the total shutdown campaign. So just sort of for those who don't know, take us back there. What do you think led to that kind of vociferous outpouring of rage when we all walked to Parliament? And
just a disclaimer, I did not walk with on the 1st of August 2018 because I was lying on the couch with a plantar fasciitis and I couldn't walk, and I felt a big sense of FOMO that this thing is happening in South Africa, and the only thing I can do is follow it on Twitter. So I think what was really interesting about the emergence of the total shutdown and specifically the kind of camping out in front of the union buildings demanding to speak to the president is that it wasn't a few organizations that has been around that has tried to kind of move into a different space and do this kind of countrywide standing together. It was a very, very different kind of activism. It had much more social media campaigning and kind of public communications that I think has, up to that point, not really been a big strength of the sector. But what Total Shutdown managed to do is to use the public communications and the social media to really, I think, spread a lot of information that caused people to feel the righteous anger. So I think that what made it really different is that it was countrywide, it had a big online presence. Someone like me who was on the couch with the foot could feel like, I mean, I can retweet, I can follow the tweets without being able to be in the street. And I think what the sector maybe hasn't done in that way in the past decade is to be really, really, really assertive about what we want, demanding to speak to the president, handing over the 24 demands. And I think that's a lot of, and I'm hoping I'm not stepping on toes, but that's a kind of masculine energy that this sector, who mostly provides services, hasn't kind of taken up before. And ironically, it did bring us a national strategic plan. Not that it's all fantastic, but I think it really was a moment that resulted in demands and accountability and something that couldn't be ignored.
So, I mean, I remember walking in, for those of us who were at that summit that initially gave birth to the plan. I remember at that time I was accompanying a delegation from Parliament, and I remember being with older MPs who were tremendously unsettled by because the campaign, as you say, was different from campaigns before. There were no boundaries in terms of what people were prepared to do almost. And so I remember walking in, and there was the panty campaign where women were holding their panties with slogans written on them, and the members of Parliament being horrified by the lack of respect shown. We had that heart-wrenching moment where we had a woman talk about how she had been raped and the surgery that she had, and she lifted up her dress in front of the president, and the unfortunate incident of somebody filming that and sending that round in a group. We had that very tumultuous moment where there was talk about potentially locking the president into a room if he didn't give us what he wanted. And some of us were going, if we did that, that's really an act of treason. If you lock a president into the room, that's a big deal. Do we really want to do that? So it was, there were all these anxieties, tensions, motions, anger in the space. And then following from this, we got this plan built around 6 pillars. And I think that for me, the interesting thing about the plan is that it's, I think, possibly the first time that I know of, and I've worked in the policy space for a long time, where government worked this much in collaboration with civil society to draft a plan. So the plan there were provincial hearings in all of the 9 provinces, and we had this plan that for the first time speaks about elements of violence that we didn't necessarily think about before. So there's 6 pillars to the plan. And the first pillar is one that is, to me, very interesting because it talks about accountability. So holding government accountable. So we have accountability and leadership. And this is interesting because actually they're saying we can hold you accountable, but I'm not quite sure to the extent to which that is practically possible. The second one looks at prevention It's prevention, healing, and social cohesion. I've never been sure about what social cohesion means, and do I want to be socially cohesive? The third is justice, safety, and protection. The fourth is response, healing, care, and support. And then the fifth, which is phenomenal, is that for the first time we link violence against women to economic power. There's a whole pillar on economic power. And the sixth is research and information. So the data, the evidence, how we understand how we are responding. So we have this comprehensive plan. However, the huge kind of stumbling block is that in making it so collaborative, it became this voluminous thing that is so fat and chunky that sometimes, and this is just me, I'm not sure what it's saying. And Jeanne, maybe you can explain it to us. It's not there. Like, give it to us like this.
I mean, I feel like I should have had wine before I was asked that question. And I think social cohesion is what happens when the Springboks win the World Cup. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. But I mean, I have to say that I think the plan does. It's like a shopping list, but for the whole of V&A Waterfront. And when you have a shopping list for the whole of V&A Waterfront, the chances of you achieving that shopping list is very, very, very small. And Alison Tilley, who is a mentor of me, always says that when everything is important, actually nothing is important. And I think
very clever, Alison.
I think the plan really makes that so visible. Where I do think the plan provides opportunity for change is because it has so much in it. If you have a strategic civil society, you really can utilize the political will that comes with the plan to ask for very specific things. And as rape crisis, we are obviously very interested in post-rape care and the sexual offences courts. And I think the plan really contributed to almost forcing different government stakeholders and civil society to work together on, for instance, the checklist for the sexual offences courts that came out of the regulations. So I think it does have a lot of use if you have enough patience to sit through all of the lots of nothingness. And I think what happened with the domestic violence legislative changes, which Mosaic was really involved in, is that it utilized the plan and the strength that the plan does have, which is to bring together different governments, departments, and civil society. But at the same time, the plan was released in 11th of March of 2020. It's now 3.5 years later, and the implementation of the plan is still held by a group of volunteers and government officials that's not being overseen by a council, that doesn't report regularly to Parliament. So the implementation is very haphazard. And I think what makes it really difficult in such a situation is to ensure that civil society participation continues to happen. Because it is one thing to say we consult civil society, but if we can't manage to get the meeting links sent out and get people to respond on the documents, then the participation is really difficult. So I think it really is on civil society to be very clear of what we want from this plan and being realistic that we're not going to shop the whole V&A on a Saturday.
Sure. I mean, I think that what you're saying is very important, that, on the one, this plan falls within a kind of broader plan of the National Development Plan, which takes us to 2030, the vision that we have holistically for the country into 2030. And this is the kind of roadmap for dealing with, not specifically violence against women and children, but gender-based violence more holistically. But as you say, the challenge is how to zone in on the things that what are the targets, what are the indicators. So Nechama, what I want to come to you now with is, when we have, and your book draws on policy frameworks for domestic violence, right? When we have a plan or a policy's response, inherently what underpins that is that there's a problem. It's based on a problematization of an issue, right? So policy responds to a problem. And how we respond says something about how we understand that problem. It also says what we leave out. So we include the response, and that's our understanding of the problem, but we leave out stuff that we don't think is necessarily part of that understanding. And in acting on that plan, we defend and disseminate that policy articulation of the response. So I'm interested in hearing from you, specifically possibly around domestic violence if you want, but also more broadly if you want. What does the policy framework say about how we understand violence against women, and what have we left out in that understanding? How have we continued to disseminate and defend a particular understanding?
All right, so let's look backwards a little bit on this, because I don't actually think that there is political will to solve the problem. I think there's political will to be seen to be addressing the problem. I don't think those two are the same. I think if we had the will to actually solve the problem, we would, because we have nearly 30 years of good law on this and potentially kind of good policies in place that have never been implemented. And if we want to look at violence against women in South Africa, we know if we want to look at the most extreme form of violence, which would be murder, but also if we want to look, so sexual offenses are a little bit, they're less closely linked to intimate partner violence, like directly linked, but pretty much all other forms of violence against adult women are majority linked to intimate partner causes. And from the 1990s, when the Nats started to sort of gradually give up a little bit of power, they started to introduce new laws that in theory were going to protect women from abusive partners, or from their husbands initially, because the only protection that was envisaged was within the context of marriage and within the context of a nuclear family. But even once we had the Domestic Violence Act introduced, again, the provisions that were put in place in the Domestic Violence Act in terms of protection orders and in terms of what was supposed to be easier, faster, cheaper, more affordable access to justice for women against their primary threat, who is their intimate partner, all right, have been in place for a really, really long time. And if we look at the history of, for example, when the Domestic Violence Act was introduced and it changed accessibility to protection orders, and it was supposed to make it faster and easier. And I mentioned this specifically in the book. So the first thing I want to say is almost laws protecting women against violence are inherently domestic violence laws, because that is the primary threat of violence towards women, is from their intimate partner in the context of a home. So they're very much tied to that in our history and in other countries' histories. If we go back even further, though, you mentioned about like the government sort of saying, oh, we take economic power into account. I think in there I mentioned even the United Nations with their discussion around women, it took them a while to acknowledge violence against women. But for nearly 40 years, we've had an acknowledgement that South Africa is a signatory to around the links between economic power or lack of access. This is not new. These are all things that we know. So we had this great, Domestic Violence Act comes in place, very, very progressive on paper for what it was at the time, but we weren't able to implement it. First of all, our judiciary at that point, the courts had lost a lot of people. So and I tracked the numbers in the book, and I'm not going to remember them off the top of my head, but we'd seen a decline in the number of just even clerks at court. Also, the judiciary and the courts were dominated very much by male employees, white male employees, particularly at the level of magistrate and judge. The police service was dominated by, white male and male generally employees. So we really had no systems that could support them. And some great statistics that I talk about from Lisa Vetten, who has just done so much work in this area, and also, looking in Gauteng. She looked at between 1 year and the next, from when the Domestic Violence Act was implemented to the next, is one court area in Joburg, and I want to say it's with Boksburg or Springs, got 4 times the number of applications for interim protection orders between 1 year and the next, but they had no increase in staff numbers. And also, it wasn't just staff that were needed, it was a photocopy machine to make copies of the documents, it was staplers, nothing was increased. So we have never resourced the implementation of these. But even at a very core level, I was talking to Judge Kathleen Satchwell, and she was saying how when she became a judge, she said she didn't even need the Domestic Violence Act. All she needed was the Constitution. You know, so since 1996, essentially, we've had this Constitution that has, in the Bill of Rights, guaranteed our right to safety. And again, so we've had everything, the same things on paper. So I think the National Strategic Plan is a political document. I think it serves a purpose of kind of collating or maybe generating fundraising. If you're smart, you can use it to actually achieve something useful out of it. But many people also use it to pursue neoliberal checklist policies, which is, I have addressed 5,000 women, tick, 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 tick. How many rape kits have you provided? Tick, 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 tick. What does it mean? Again, we work on numbers. And this kind of plan enables that kind of thinking in the same way as the Sustainable Development Goals enable a very modularized kind of thinking that has limited utility in the real world. So I think when we look at this, is we've had these laws and we've had the provisions for them on paper for a very long time. And what concerns me is the deliberate refusal to, and you point this out, or maybe it was Jeanne, I'm going to get confused as who said it, but it's kind of when you ask for social cohesion, right? How do you demonstrate that you have achieved that as a goal? So in an annual report, they will have, the departments love these things, of what percentage of their target they've achieved. My target for this year was to achieve 100% social cohesion, which no one can measure, right? But I've achieved 95% social cohesion. Now I'm on target. And I think what government does consistently is it sets targets that are meaningless but great on a report, and they use that to avoid actually doing the work that we know how to do and we've known for at least 30 years how to do.
I mean, you touch on something that makes me think about, we have this plan, right, Jeanne? At the same time, there have been pieces of work, disjointed pieces and not necessarily comprehensive pieces on trying to cost violence. And at the same time, so just a step back, looking at the context of our very strained fiscus, right? Like if we look at the budget and we look at money going to different departmental votes, and we look at consistent year-on-year budget cuts, spending on service delivery since 2012, we are having to operate the project of state capture and what that has done to the fiscus, the ways in which that has crippled the economy, has meant that the state has had to adopt a policy of austerity measures. And so those austerity measures are that there's less money, we have to consolidate our debt, the focus is on kind of narrowing the gap in terms of what we borrow. But that has had very real implications on people's lives. I've done some work trying to track money being allocated to resource this plan. And it's the systems are not set up so that you can easily track it. Like you can waste, and try this. If you have lots of time to waste, try and track money going to the plan.
Oh, wow. No, you can't.
You can probably waste an entire career
I've
on
literally
it.
just done an analysis of the justice, but it's not there.
It's not there. So, and for example, like you would have, you'd have to go and ask follow-up questions because you would have, say, training allocated, a generic budget for training, and then you have to dig deep and go and ask somebody how much of this went to training people on sexual offences or whatever. So tell us about the aspect of, to what extent has this plan been resourced where we can actually breathe parts of it into life?
Yeah, so, I mean, I want to say something about the measuring and realize, and firstly, maybe let me just put it out there that while I'm still a co-convener of Pillar 3, I have indicated that I want to step down, but we haven't been able to, as a civil society participants in the Pillar, elect 2 other representatives. We only have managed to elect 1. So, I mean, I'm on my way out as a co-convener. I feel like I've done kind of my job. But what I do want to say is that there are, in as much as I totally agree with Nechama about the political will wanting to be presented perhaps instead of it really being there. I think there are other positive indicators. For instance, that the Department of Women, Youth, Persons with Disabilities has asked the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation to assist with drafting up a monitoring framework for the plan.
And that's a big thing, right?
Which is a big thing, and which isn't something that is usually done with these kinds of policy documents. So while this hasn't happened yet, there's definitely a realization that this is something that we need, that the plan that we currently have is really not implementable and measurable, and is the result of a lot of negotiations around a lot of tables with tugging and pulling. So I think that's a positive.
And sorry, Jeanne, just to clarify, so you're saying that the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation will build targets and indicators into all government plans, so it will filter from the strategic plan into the annual performance plans,
so
be reported on in the annual
yes.
reports. Okay.
So that's the one positive. Theoretically, the National Council, for which
Maybe just explain to everybody.
Oh,
what that
sure.
is.
So the National Council is supposed to be the overseeing body of the NSP, ensuring that it is being implemented. And there's been a long kind of, dragging of feet and negotiation to come up with a bill for this council to be set up. It has been introduced in the National Assembly. It has to go to the National Council of Provinces, and the idea is that the council will be able to take the feedback from this framework and present it to the Portfolio Committee on Women, and so it would have a similar accountability structure as other government departments. What I do want to say about the fiscus, and this is again, I think there's a lot to say about, is it right that more money isn't being given to violence against women, or is it wrong? I think the reality is that we don't have enough money. But I think the other reality is that a lot of what is in the plan, for instance, the rollout of more TCCs and post-rape care services, can be done in a very different way than it's being done now. The current model is extremely expensive.
Do you want to just maybe explain what the
Sure.
two Zeta care centers are?
Sure. So the two Zela care centers are a one-stop service model located in 61 across the country. Most of them are at hospitals and National Department of Health facilities, and they offer basically 5 components: medical care, a forensic examination, psychosocial support, the opportunity to report a case to the police, with the national prosecuting overseeing that investigation, and then referral for longer-term counseling. So these have been recognized as a best practice model internationally. They are not perfect. Elisa Vetten has written report on them as well. But there really is a lot to work with if we want to respond to survivors. And if we look at that as an example, currently they are very resource intensive, human resource intensive, bricks and mortar and lots of salaries and furnitures, but actually they can be delivered in a much, much leaner way. Yaki Wessels, which is the regional court president in Limpopo, part of the magistracy, has visited Egypt. I can't say where, but for instance, they have a WhatsApp model of coordinating the set of services to be delivered. So really looking at what resources are there already. Could nurses be trained to also offer containment counseling? Could NGOs that already work in an area be trained to offer the containment counseling? Could the prosecutor who works at the local court be a link between the survivor and the national prosecuting soccer unit. So it really is looking at how we use the resources smartly. But that takes a lot of civil society push and conversation. So I think that's my comment about the fiscus, is we're not going to get more money. We need to push for it to be spent better.
And I think that what's worth pointing out is the KPMG did a study a couple of years ago trying to look at the costs of gender-based violence. I think that's how they framed it. And what they looked at was the different categories of costs. So you have the tangible costs and the intangible costs. And so, for example, it was divided into the victim has tangible costs, like the cost of taking a taxi to go to court. There's the intangible costs, the cost to her mental health, which might impact on her longevity of life. They're the cost to the perpetrator, both tangible and intangible. There's the cost to government, the cost to businesses, the costs to civil society. And what they managed to show through that study is that the victim bears 80-odd% of that cost, and government bears the least. I think it was around 2% or something. I can't quite remember. And the point that I think needs to be made is that the fiscus is constrained, but it is about getting the priorities right, because the costs to society, and you deal with this very well in your book, Nechama, in terms of the cumulative effect of violence to society are far greater than putting money into addressing it. And I think, Nechama, like there was a part where I just read and went, oh my God, you talk about the protection orders and how that has actually, one of the things that it's done and accomplished is to make tracking domestic violence easier. It hasn't necessarily made the prevention of domestic violence. It hasn't had an impact at that level. And so, just maybe to frame this discussion before I move to the question to you, is that, in the field of this violence, we talk about two areas of work, and they kind of, there's a continuum between them, but we talk about what Jeanne has been talking about, is response. How do we respond when somebody is a victim of violence, and how do we provide psychosocial support, access to medical care, accessing the criminal justice system? That's the response side of the work. But then there's another leg of the work, which is the prevention side. How do you address the structural drivers of violence at its root? Otherwise, you're just putting plaster on a Band-Aid. And heretofore, the state has not quite had its act together in terms of properly working with prevention initiatives and using evidence and data. And there's a whole body of work. In fact, our country, through the Medical Science Research Council, started the What Works program, which is a model internationally of best practice for violence prevention work. And this is our stuff. It started here in this country, but we're not using it and we're not learning from it, and it blows the mind. So Nechama, coming to you, I want to focus specifically on that prevention part and talking a little bit about the socio-ecological model of violence. So in terms of the socio-ecological model, you have like the broad picture, so if you imagine it as a series of concentric circles, that biggest circle on the outside is what Jeanne is talking about, the work where we work at changing our society. That's where a lot of us work, right? It's changing the laws, the policies. Then you come a layer in, and it's the layer of working within communities, which is really, really necessary. The work where you look at social norms, behavioral change. Those are not things you're going to change overnight. That's long-term work. Funders hate it because there's no quick results. To measure that change happens over a long period of time, and no one wants to put money into that. Then you come a layer closer, and that's the level of the family, what's happening there in terms of toxic masculinities and the norms within which families function. And then right at the center of that circle is the individual, right? In this case, in the case of your book, the woman experiencing the violence. So maybe just talk to us a bit about that very striking moment in your book where it's not preventing the violence, it's actually just making it easy for us to track. In a number of different places in the book, you talk about that we're not dealing with the structural drivers at a very fundamental level.
I think it also raises questions about how we understand each of those problems. Somebody messaged me on social media about 2 months ago, and they said, look, I know we don't have very good data on this, but could you help me explain? And I was like, no, we actually have very good data in South Africa, because exactly as you say, we've had a lot of, violence has been a problem for a very, very long time, and we've had very excellent researchers producing really the best data that I'm aware of in the world about violence against women, to be honest. At a very consistent level. But the question is, what do we do with that information, and how do we link it through to other things? And so let's use the protection order as kind of the locus to explore that, where I mention in the book how protection orders are not protecting women at all. There's no evidence that I can see that protection orders are reducing violence that women experience. We know that in situations where women are with a very controlling partner in particular, getting a protection order similar to attempting to leave is a trigger point, at which the control may sort of suddenly escalate to the point of violence or death. But when I started linking, so what does the protection order do? It creates a forensic chain of evidence that when she dies, you can prove that it was actually murder because he'd already done stuff to her before, right? Which is useless, particularly for the woman in question. When you start delving through to other events or crimes that might be linked to that protection order, what was really interesting for me was to see in SAPS's kind of quite garbled and fudgy, mushy reporting on their crime statistics, the way they describe domestic violence. When they go through category by category, and you kind of have to really cleverly search through the documents, before we get to the point of murder, right? So the protection order is not the first, act of saying stop that a woman does usually. She would have attempted to say stop many times before, or no.
Can I ask you to explain your term murder by installment as well as you do this?
So, I say on the back of the book, sorry, it's very exciting, whatever's happening above. And is... On the back of the book itself, I say that, when a woman is killed, this isn't usually the first act of violence, it's just the last that she experiences. And the conceptualization for this book emerged from a conversation with Glynis Breitenbach, where she was talking about sort of a legal precedent where a woman had killed her abusive partner, not in an instance when she was being attacked. And this dates back to a case in Canada where the partner was killed, I think, while he had his back turned. And that it was later used in South African courts and then became precedent through its use, which was expecting a woman to wait until the moment when her life is under threat is tantamount to sentencing her to murder by installment. And so what protection orders are is they track those installments. That's all they do. But there are other ways that we can see that, and where the police could easily act and disrupt if there was will and intention. So things that shocked me, I'm still surprised by some of this, even after quite a long time of researching murder, is the majority of arson cases in many provinces are directly related to domestic violence. The majority of malicious damage to property cases are directly related to domestic violence. A huge number, maybe half or more of assault and assault GBH cases are related to domestic violence. So this shows that there's this incremental rise in crimes. So if somebody is trashing his girlfriend's cell phone or setting fire to something of his, that is the start of potentially something that could increase and the violence could escalate. And that is the point that we need to interrupt. We shouldn't be tracking. Yes, all the advice is to keep track of all these incidents so that when you go for your protection order, which is useless, right? I really cannot see any evidence that it is useful. Also, when somebody gets arrested, when they contravene a protection order, they don't necessarily, because cops don't always help you, they don't necessarily get arrested for abuse or for assault or criminal injury. They get arrested for contempt of court, because they're in contempt of the order. So that is the crime that they've committed, is they're in contempt of the order. So we've created, I suppose, a bit like, this is when I say the NSP is a political document, I think that people in many parts of the government and definitely in civil society are not that genuinely there is a strong desire to want to transform the society into one where we all feel safe. And I understand that the intention of these things is well meant, but when we look at it on paper, there's no follow through. So So many women are dying literally with protection orders in their handbags, with protection orders in place, because there is no proactive response from policing. And you mentioned about that, the sort of reducing concentric circles. The home is one of them. That's where Thabo Mbeki wanted us to concentrate our crime fighting efforts, was to bolster the home. We need to maybe abandon the idea of what constitutes a home, that it's the same for everybody, that a nuclear family is the same for everybody. We definitely need to reject the idea that a family is more important than a woman's life. We need to reject the idea that a woman should go back and fix things because it's more important that her family is kept together than that she is kept intact. But at that family level and at the individual level, we can't fight enough there. You talk about budgets and availability. So I recently went through all the justice and policing budgets this week with the Wits Justice Project. The police budget is 105 billion rand a year. More than half of that is spent on visible policing. Now, seeing as we can debate whether police should exist or not, but they do. Seeing as they do, they should be doing something. Seeing as we're paying like 50 billion rand a year for police services, we should be expecting something more proactive there than collecting paper after a woman's died. And then I just have to add one more thing and then I'll shut up, is that also understanding that arresting perpetrators and putting them in jail is not always the solution that we want. For many women, they just want the abuse to stop. They don't want the relationship to end. They don't want their breadwinner to be incarcerated. And that's something that's quite tricky to get into your head, is that it's not about lock him up, remove him from society. And it does speak back to somehow dealing with these issues of sort of toxic masculinity, family values. It's a mess. We are in a mess. But there's lots of money. Just as you say, not allocated to the right places. And I think smarter spending would be so valuable, if only.
If only.
There's so much, there's a can of worms you opened there, but I am very aware that we only have 10 minutes and I need to open up to the floor. Are there any questions from the floor? Alison.
Forgive me.
Binoda, you next.
This is where I say, it's more of a comment than a question.
Sure.
I remember when the Domestic Violence Act was passed, and up to that point, I was the sort of, in my firm, I was the one who did the urgent interdicts to the High Court on a Friday afternoon because people were worried they were going to die over the weekend. And that cost, a great deal of money, and probably in today's terms, that would probably be 100,000 rand or more. When the domestic violence legislation was introduced, one of the first orders that I sought was in Kales River, where the magistrates had never seen the Domestic Violence Act, and I had to go and explain to them in chambers what the act was, and then we came out again and got the order. Now I think magistrates all know what a domestic violence order is. The clerks of the court know what it is. And you can get an order. The value of the order is an interesting question. But I think certainly from the police's point of view, it does create a line in the sand. And that is a useful thing to have. So I think I wouldn't perhaps be quite so bleak about domestic violence orders and what they do and what they don't do. I think what we do know is that certainly the criminal justice system is very abusive towards victims, and it is a secondary trauma that we have to deal with. And if victims choose that route, one of the things we can do is work to make the trauma less. I don't think we can avoid it, right? So I think there are various strands that you can pull on. Does that end violence? No, of course it doesn't. But if you can go to a TCC and get patched up and get, pregnancy prevention, SED prevention, you get your PEP, you get a rape kit done. So in the event that you need or want to go to court, that can happen. These may seem like small victories, but remember we come from a history not so long ago where marital rape was not a crime. And I think that's perhaps to give people a little hope and a sense of agency, that change is possible. Yes, it's small. Yes, it's iterative. We used to talk about date rape. I don't think we talk about date rape anymore. We talk about rape. All of these small changes in framing the thing, you know, it's for me, I think that's, I would want us to at least consider the possibility that those are something that matters, certainly to victims.
And Alison, you know, to also articulate that those changes did not fall from the sky. Like, I think that people in this room and others have worked very hard. You know, it's a result of feminist interventions largely that brought about those changes. And I think particularly when you're in the sector and working within the sector, that it does sometimes feel bleak and overwhelming. But to not forget the incremental gains made, that when the cumulative effect of it is that we are in a fundamentally different position from what we were when rape in marriage was not a crime. Vinola for everyone is one of those people who I've known forever and started a feminist grassroots movement many, many years ago, and she's still doing her community-based feminism. So deep respect for you, Vinola.
Thank you very much. And my contribution is also from that pathway. I think that the total shutdown and the violence campaign in society has given rise to the NSP. And I think that's also, you have been in Parliament. The women's movement in the 80s and 90s has given rise to Parliament and the women's caucuses, the national machinery.
Absolutely.
And then there was a delinking with the movements. And I think that is always the thing. And then the beauty is that we have developed the technical expertise of you now knowing what is the best way that this NSP need to work, what is the gap, so we have that. But the delinking with the grassroots movement is going to be the work in the future, and so that the sooner we take that back. So we have started a grassroots women's gender-based violence, community-led, women-led gender-based violence alliance with community-based organizations where the victims on which experiences we have created this, the reason why there is an NSP in the first place, is now saying that we don't want to just be the beneficiaries, the people that is targeted as project beneficiaries, or we are the victims or survivors. We want to be part of the conversation. We want to be part of the solution. We want to be part of the future. And I mean, there's also if we do not have the conversation there, you talk about the tangible what? Cost, yes. And then the intangible cost. But I think the intangible cost that you talk about is, I would rather talk about invisible cost. That is very tangible. It impacts women's community lives, their relationships, their ability to be a parent, their ability to keep the family, the family dysfunction, and their own dysfunction. So there's a tangible material result. So it's not intangible, I think it's rather invisible. So I think that invisible part is also that we need to start conversation. And conversation with the women on which basis this NSP has gone is going to be the future. Thanks.
I think, Vinola, prevention, pillar 2, the prevention, social cohesion one is, given also the fact that, I mean, all of these need to link back to communities, right? But specifically that one, like, how do you do prevention without working at community level? And I think that there's like, are you in pillar 2? Because if you're not, I think I should just co-opt you, right? We are pillaring from below. Pillaring from below.
So, but
okay,
I think
love
this
it.
is, when I went to the first summit, I found very unpleasant for a number of other reasons. It was that the discussion that I thought we were going to be having wasn't able to be had because there was a lot of there was an outpouring. And I mean, I also felt angry that I felt very triggered through a lot of the exposure to, it was like being, a lot of it was quite violent actually.
Yes.
And then over the years, when I think about it, I'm quite critical of a lot of those approaches, and I think there's value in that. But I'm not saying there's no value in there needs to be all of this. We need to be sort of, all of these approaches need to be happening at once. And the perspective that I come from now is if we look at, since our COVID lockdowns have been lifted, and we had artificially low rates of certain types of crimes, our femicide numbers have increased to from around 8 women a day. But the last Medical Research Council femicide report was around 8 women a day. It's a stable rate that we'd held since 2009. It's risen to around 11 women a day. So our femicide numbers in the last 2 years, there's a COVID bounce back that has happened that is only starting to plateau now. And particularly femicide rates have risen higher. The homicide rates rose as well, but the femicide rates have risen even higher within that. So something terrible is going on. So we have the right structures in place, but we're missing something very important. So I'm very grateful that there are other people who are doing the listening and who are doing the community work. I don't have the skills or the empathy for that. I'm not good at that, and I'm aware of that. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Exactly. That relinking that has to happen is really important. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
The inherent indigenous knowledge.
Yeah.
Should we give the 1 million, 30 billion for the NSP on the top, and give 1 billion for the NSP at the bottom, and see what amazing monitoring and evaluation
exactly. The
system
one
you're
will
gonna
do.
get with that little money.
I hear you. So we had Sue over there. Do you still want to say something, Sue? Okay, so we're running out of time. Sue, very quickly, and then the last comment. And I just want to say, Vanola, that, on that part of what you're also touching on now is co-option of people into state processes. And also the institutionalization. So the National Council is going to be another structure that is funded, and people from civil society entering into the space of the state at exorbitant salaries, and yet,
With benefits.
With benefits, and we could also be tapping into people on the ground who actually have indigenous, local, inherent knowledge of the communities in which they live, and they know what the responses should be at that level. And that's social cohesion.
And the Springboks.
And the Springboks. Okay. Sue, quick, and then, sorry, I don't know your name.
I've recently been doing quite a few stories on GBV and rape for the publication Spotlight, and discovered a lot of, as you say, terrible things are happening. And the one gap that seems to be very prominent is, you talk about containment counseling. But it seems that so many women are so deeply traumatized, and they don't just need containment, they need serious mental health attention. There seems to be a terrible lack, and I think it's meant to be funded and assisted with by the Department of Health. Can you comment on that? There just seems to be a massive gap for the mental health needs of GBV victims.
Can we just take the last?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Hi, I am Abigail. I used to work at Marie Claire before Associated closed, and it was kind of just after Donald Trump got elected, and this big wave of feminism in the popular media. So it was quite an exciting time trying to kind of pivot these legacy brands and make them more relevant and talk more about issues that women were facing in their real lives. So I think my question is partly to Nechama, but to everybody around this conversation in the media. Has it shifted? Is it still exactly where it was? Do you think the total shutdown moment has led to a better understanding? And on top of that, I grew up in the 90s with Hip to be Square and Love Life, and those were hugely effective. And my question is, what's our equivalent of that for GBV? Because what does GBV mean, as you say?
It's quite a funny thing to link to that.
I'm going to ask you to respond and do closing comments in one, and then
I'll make sure it's all done. is I'm a bit older than you, and my first job as a reporter was at Marie Claire in 1997. And I want to say that women's magazines were actually quite forward-thinking. In fact, women's magazines and the women's pages were the only places in South African media where issues of violence against women were actually regularly covered. So we've been doing this work for a very, very long time from a reporting point of view. So again, it's kind of have things shifted? No, the terminology has changed a little bit. There are broader understandings. I think the important points about how our language changes and how that represents changes in how society understands things. The fact that marital rape didn't used to exist as a crime. The fact, we need to be aware of how all of these things have changed over time. So when we research the past, understanding that different words might have been used, and certain things that we understand today to be crimes, even kind of, gay sex. So things change. But what the media, particularly women's media, has been doing, women's media has been on this for a very long time. The very first reports of power of rape crisis were all stuck on the women's pages in the Rand Daily Mail, in the late 1970s, early 80s, as this was starting to become acknowledged. We didn't have words for it until then. And it was activists and it was the media that gave us words for those things. And we gave words to the politicians that then they could use to make grand-sounding speeches. And unfortunately, I think we're still at the stage of grand-sounding speeches. We have exceptional activists. We have very resilient women. We need mental health support for men and women because everybody's a bit screwed, to be honest. And but yeah, so we still have grand-sounding speeches. We thankfully still have some excellent journalists in the country. It would be wonderful if we resourced our media a lot more to do more of that. But I don't actually think anything's changed.
Jeanne?
Yeah, I'm going to answer the question about the mental health first. And the difference between containment counseling and longer-term counseling is like if you fall down the stairs and there's someone with like an emergency medicine that's going to make sure that don't bleed out, and then you go to the hospital and the doctor is going to make sure that you're okay and give you the stitches and so on. So containment counseling is very specifically focusing on directly after the incident. But there are quite a number of organizations, for instance, Rape Crisis, Mosaic, that provides longer-term counseling in a 12-session model for survivors, and with referral mechanisms to other organizations like Cape Mental Health or psychiatric services or psychological services. However, it's often not known, and what's really important is that in the immediate after effects of the incident, that you get the information of how to access the longer-term mental health services. And I do think that the media has changed. I remember when I joined Rape Crisis and we started the campaign on the sexual offences courts, we had a conversation with Marianne Tam about how do we build a media strategy. And there was a lot of education about what is a sexual offences court, why are they necessary to reduce the trauma, why do they need special people and infrastructure to help reduce the trauma. And it was really education. And now, if you speak to a lot of people that don't work in the GBV space, that are academics at the University of Pretoria, they will tell you about sexual offences courts. And I think what the media does still do is to give us the language of what to ask for. And I think that is something that is being built on. Whether or not we always get it is a different question, but I think some of the examples is that we do get it, and we do get the change, and the media helps us to find the words.
On that note, I want to end by saying that we find ourselves on the cusp of 30 years of democracy at a very interesting nexus in time, where I think that it's safe to say that if you want to be where passive citizenry is not, it's a luxury, it's not the best thing for us to do right now. In the face of the findings of the Zondo Commission and the huge impact of the state capture project on our country, we are resource constrained, we are living in a context with high levels of violence. If you live in a house with a fence and an alarm, it still affects you, it affects all of us. As long as there are these deep levels of entrenched poverty and such huge gaps of inequity between the haves and the have-nots, it is all of our problem, our collective problem. And we want to leave a different kind of legacy behind for those who are to come. And so right now, I think that it's the people, the stakeholders in our society, like the journalists and the activists, the rape crises, the mosaics, they are playing such an important role and thinly stretched with very little resources. I come from an activist time where there were other feminist organizations like the Gender Advocacy Project, JETNet, and these were the organizations that looked at holding political accountability and input into policy processes. They've been shut down because there are no resources. And so the ones that we have are the ones dealing with violence against women. They are precious. And we need to keep them going and keep them alive and keep them vibrant because they're playing an instrumental role in our society that touches each of our lives. And so step up and give them contributions, volunteer your time, be an active citizen. We're all parts of healing this broken country. I want to thank our two speakers, thank all of you for spending time with us.